Hi, I'm Michael Brooks from theelusiveobvious.com and Civic Actions, and I'm in David Pakman Studios talking with David Pakman. So, David, I want to ask you, first of all, I think a lot of people on the left were pretty happy with how this Republican primary is going because it's basically a disaster and an embarrassment for all concerned. But David Sirota wrote a piece last week where he actually said that in his view, it's really dangerous because basically we're just having a far-right, crazy, free-for-all debate. And the end result is going to be that the conversation moves further to the right-wing extreme because there isn't a counterbalance. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a risk of that. I'm torn on this because on one hand, I say to myself, the crazier the candidate is on the right, the more likely in theory it is that that agenda will be rejected and that President Obama will be reelected.
Right.
And for all the problems I have with Obama, that will be better than the alternative. There's two risks, though. Risk number one is that something weird ends up happening in the last month before the election, and because of some fluke, that crazy candidate on the right wins. Okay, that would be like the biggest disaster.
Yeah.
And second to that, I think you're right, which is that if the discourse keeps getting pushed to the right, if all of a sudden discussions about contraception and maybe a separation between church and state isn't that rigid, all of these things, yeah, the conversation moves to the right, and the next election, these are issues once again, which really shouldn't be. So yeah, that's a huge risk.
And then kind of following up on that, and barring the terrifying scenario of something happening in the last month and, Rick Santorum becoming president, what if there's a certain line of thinking that goes that if Mitt Romney gets the nomination, he loses, the extreme, crazy right, they won't learn the lesson. They'll just go again with he wasn't a purist, he wasn't the real deal.
He wasn't conservative
enough. He wasn't fanatical enough. What if the Republicans nominate their id, Rick Santorum, full crazy, full on, he loses really badly, which is most likely what will happen. I agree with you that there's a risk. And there's like a clear repudiation of that. Do you think that that's better for the country and the Republican Party in the long run?
I don't know if it's better for the Republican Party from the point of view of will it get them to win elections. I think it's better for the country for sure. And the thing is, if you look at actual polls, fairly worded polls about the issues we're talking about, the country doesn't really agree with Rick Santorum on social issues, right? I mean, when you ask about, if you do a fair poll about should the government provide some basic level of health care to everybody, more than 2/3 of Americans say, yeah, the government should. Now, when you phrase it, do you support a government takeover of health care? No, you're not going to get people agreeing because it's coded with a lot of words that people see negatively. Same thing on contraception. I mean, almost everybody uses contraception. Why is it a political debate?
Oh my God.
Exactly, and so the fact that that the country doesn't actually support that social agenda eventually has to come out, right? I mean, I'm hopeful. It's not a rhetorical question. At some point, that has to be reflected in who is elected, and that would mean Rick Santorum can't win.
Right. Want to take it a kind of broader lens on this. So the weather's cooled down. The Occupy movement is out of the headlines. But I think it's had an impact. I think it's definitely affected the way the issues are being framed, income inequality, jobs, the kind of real crisis points are back in the news. What do you think is going to happen with that movement, whether or not it's still Occupy, but the people raising those important issues, how is that going to come back out again in the spring, summer, and fall and affect this election?
Well, the most likely way that it will come back out, it will be candidates taking the opportunity to kind of co-opt it as their movement, a movement they either supported or in some way with their actions in the 70s helped to create the political framework within which it could exist, right? We'll see that kind of opportunistic use of it. Will there be any Occupy candidates? I know on the Young Turks there's an Occupy candidate which was recently interviewed. Whether that has any legs, I don't really know. I think the way that it's already shown itself more without being named an effect of the Occupy movement is Eric Cantor talking about income disparity without dismissing it as an issue that doesn't exist. His solution was one I don't agree with at all, but he mentioned it as a real issue. Income disparity is a problem. That's a big step by itself to have the Republican Party even mention that without laughing it off as a concern of bleeding heart liberals.
Right. Absolutely. Glenn Greenwald wrote I think he actually points this out pretty frequently, but his point is that in an election year, we get polarized around our candidates. We get scared. I think a lot of people who maybe were more critical of Obama after watching Mitt and Rick and these people talk for a couple of months, that's been pretty clarifying. But at the same time, the danger he points out is that we might lose track of bigger issues, not highlight the areas where the whole system is in question, the whole game is in question, and get lost in the kind of personality contest, as important as it may be. How do you think that we can keep those bigger issues at the forefront, while at the same time, obviously, following the election, knowing there's big differences, enjoying the process, being aware of the process, but not losing sight of the kind of bigger issues that Glenn's talking about?
It's difficult for two reasons, because on the one hand, you kind of hear both sides saying, are these social issues like gay marriage really issues that should be occupying so much of the campaign discussion? And both parties kind of say no, except then you get back to something which Michael Schor said when he was on my show, and he was with Robin Kerner, who's this Ron Paul supporter. Yeah. And he said, the thing is, that's an important lens through which we can look at candidates. And if you have candidates on the right, that fine, maybe those social issues aren't the most important thing. Maybe we should be focusing on the broader, more important economic and kind of forward-looking issues. It's very hard for those on the left to put those issues aside and say, well, maybe I do agree with Ron Paul on a lot of economic stuff. You can't really put aside his rejection of evolution, right? These social issues, both parties kind of say they shouldn't be the main issue, but neither party is willing to let them kind of go unnoticed or undiscussed either. So it's kind of a conundrum.
Right. Right. What about on the kind of flip side of that? Because I think you're right. It's in these social issues where the disparities and the real differences and the real reasons for voting and not kind of lazily equating the parties 100% really show up. But what about in areas where, like the drone program as an example, or military detentions, areas where Obama has, he's accepted a pretty right-wing or pretty executive power consensus on those issues, and then barring Ron Paul, who's in his own world, doing his own thing in his own special way, all the rest of the Republicans are, if any, they just want to bring torture back and make even more belligerent, ridiculous speeches. So how about in those areas where there's actually maybe a troubling, rough consensus? Not that there aren't differences, but there is some consensus. How do we bring those issues up, get those out there?
Well, here's the risk with that. On the right, there's a very clear fragmentation, right? You have the religious right, then you have kind of the Tea Party crowd, you have the libertarian movement, which is more supportive of Ron Paul. Sure. You have the kind of pro-business side, which probably would tend to go for Romney if we look at the current four candidates. So there's very clear fragmentation on the right. On the left, it seems that the voters are really more united about what their positions are. Where the split is what are they willing to kind of forgive or put aside as far as Obama goes when deciding whether to vote for him again, right? So some people are on one camp, which is, I don't care if the Republican will be even worse. I can't reward President Obama for being so close to the Republican position on a lot of those topics you mentioned by voting for him again, right? They say, I don't care if it has to get worse before it gets better. I won't support it. And then there's those on the left who probably actually hold similar views to the group I just described, but who realize we have a choice here, and even if if the political spectrum is this wide and Republicans and Democrats are this far apart, I still want to be as close to the left as possible. And Barack Obama is slightly closer. They're not missing the forest for the trees, so to speak. Right. That's the fragmentation I see, and I don't know how to get past that, actually.
Yeah, and that small margin is the difference between almost literally life and death in many instances.
Right.
What's your one reason, if you had to sum it up really concisely, why are you voting for Obama again?
The Republican field. I mean, that's the reason, right? It's choices, and you have to say we criticize Obama a lot on my show, and I get criticized for criticizing Obama a lot on my show. But in the end, the Republican field is the reason I'll be voting for Barack Obama.
Right. Makes sense. All right. Thanks a lot, David.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for having me.